Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ahead of the Curve, the podcast where we explore the latest trends, challenges, and innovations shaping global markets. I'm Laura McLean, and today we're diving into one of the most critical and fast evolving sectors, energy. With shifting geopolitics, regulatory changes, and the ongoing energy transition, the landscape is more complex than ever. To help us navigate this, I'm joined by Maryam Salman, an expert in energy markets and policy. We'll be discussing the latest trends in MENA and European energy markets, the evolving regulatory landscape, and the strategies energy firms need to stay ahead of the curve. So, Maryam, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Lauren.
I know you have a very impressive background, but it would be great to our listeners to hear it from you. So could you give us a little intro about your background and where you currently are in your current role?
Sure, very happy to be here on the podcast. The topic is very timely, of course. Lots happening around the transition space. And some things that we're noticing, of course, are market fatigue for hydrogen, but a lot of interest in things like data centers and AI. So how do I come into all of that? I personally am senior consultant for Middle East energy markets at Qamar. I lead the commercial and economic consulting portfolio in the oil and gas, renewables, new energy sectors. You could think of it as the entire value chain for energy. As a professional, I do lots of strategy development and regulatory design. So, things that you have already touched upon, looking at policy frameworks, legislations, and how those are impacting energy trends across the MENA region most widely. And then, of course, also looking at associated markets. So Europe, Asia, because these are key export markets for the Middle East countries. So how do these policies impact them over there? I have been the author for a number of important reports in the region. I cover Iraq quite widely, and it's also a personal interest of mine, the country. I was looking at powering Iraq, challenges facing the electricity sector there for the Al Bayan Center. I've done a couple of chapters for IRENA for the renewable energy analyses, and I was a supporting author for the UAE's role in the global hydrogen economy, which was prepared on behalf of ADQ, Mubadala, and the UAE Ministry of Energy. So yeah, I'd say that's a little bit about me in a nutshell. My background when I started out was as a socioeconomic journalist. I was covering a lot of environmental and energy issues in Oman. And environmentalism was very close to me at the point. I did my master's in international relations and focusing sort of on energy security in the Middle East. And that was sort of my foray into the sector as a whole.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. So let's dive into the state of the energy markets today. So we've seen some major global events impact energy markets as a whole. So how are the MENA and European markets reacting? So what have you seen? What trends? What kind of impacts have you seen directly?
Sure. That is a loaded question, and of course with a lot of different answers to it. I'm going to sort of put it down into 5 major trends that I have been observing. One, of course, is to do with the shift in energy trade routes and energy diversification. The second is, the renewed push for energy security, nationalism, and energy independence. Third is the growth of renewables, which is still being pursued very aggressively, but more so in the MENA region compared to other markets. And lastly, I would say that the hydrogen fatigue that is impacting the market. And so for all 5 of these, there are certain factors that impact all of them. So, of course, we had the geopolitical tensions starting from 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that, of course, resulted in quite a bit of market shock for oil and gas markets specifically. The EU wants to reduce its reliance on Russia as much as possible. And so the impact of the sanctions was that, we're not going to be taking any more Russian gas. We need to move away from this. And while doing this, we are going to be pushing more aggressively for our own energy security. But instead of the methods we had pursued before, we are going to look at new partners. So, and who is that new partner that is close to us and is, relatively well placed to supply us? lies with our energy resource, it's the MENA region. And so you have North Africa to the south of Europe, and then you have the GCC region. And these countries are well endowed, right? They are mostly large oil and gas exporters, maybe a few in North Africa are importers, but have great resources. They are also great centers for renewable energy. They are on the best sun belt in the world and receive high radiation, and that opens the prospect for the EU to tap into these markets to establish for itself an energy corridor. So because it's pursuing its own energy transition, it also wants to make use of green energy from these markets and not only rely on oil and gas in the short term just for energy security purposes. So it wants these countries to export green energy to it, and that can also take the form of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen if deemed necessary. And this sort of complements what the MENA countries are doing themselves in terms of the transition. So, they have recognized that, okay, there is a new market that has suddenly opened with the EU crisis now that Russia cannot supply gas to it anymore. So why don't we step in and take advantage of this? We have the resources for it, and they are cost competitive, probably far cheaper than other exporters to the EU. If we're talking about levelized costs of green electricity, they're some of the cheapest in the world in the Middle East. And even oil and gas, not just in terms of cost, but even the carbon intensity of the oil and gas produced in the Middle East, it's much lower than other competitors. And so that's a consideration. The EU is obviously championing climate action and being on top of the green agenda. And so insofar as the MENA region can, show that its resources are lower carbon, it always has a case to establish a market base in the EU. And that can probably also extend in the near future to things like green products, green steel, green ammonia, green aluminum, celestial aluminum, which the UAE is already providing to automakers like BMW because it attracts a good green premium. Now, of course, because of what happened in 2022 with the Russian invasion, a lot of the focus suddenly came back to immediate energy security, right? The EU cannot just suddenly jump into renewables or into hydrogen. There are still a few years to that. And so because there's suddenly a shortage of gas, the focus was, of course, oil and gas. We need that from some other partners. And so the MENA region can provide this, but of course, the MENA countries are also part of the OPEC organization. It's a big cartel that sort of plays as a balancing act for global oil prices. Now, the MENA region, it had these historic cuts that it implemented after COVID that's sort of been carrying on over now well into 2024, 25. And now it's only just decided that, okay, you know what, we're going to start unwinding them. And I would say that's probably a cautious strategic shift because they're observing some strong fundamentals and a positive outlook in the energy market. Maybe demand is picking up, which had slowed down in 2024, but they always maintain that, we can always reverse this. So yes, we are going to open the taps on supply, and there is more oil that is going to come into the market. But pending on any other wildcard event that happens, or maybe the market doesn't react the way we expected it to, we can always turn that back. And one point that stands out in that, or something that we should be considering, the US is now, well, at least it's there, that Trump is considering the removal of some Russian sanctions. Although these are not specified what these could be, and it's part of his agenda to end the war in Ukraine. And if that's on energy, that could result in potential oversupply. And that gives OPEC a case of, because although Russia is part of the OPEC plus cartel, they have always pushed for more production. They want their oil to be out there. And so if some sanctions are removed, there is more Russian oil that comes into the market. The rest of the OPEC cartel might be, especially de facto leader Saudi, that, okay, you know what, we're going to pull in the reins a little bit. We want to tighten the market some more. Now, that could also be counteracted by the sanctions on Iran. So Trump has promised his maximum pressure campaign once again. And there is going to be some renewed scrutiny on tankers, logistically and practically how that takes effect has not yet been hammered out. But that, it impacts market sentiment. And so the expectation is that, okay, Iran under Biden had sort of been exporting about 1.6 to 1.8 million barrels a day quite freely. And that's going to be pulled back a fair bit. So then the market is going to become tight. So maybe in that case, OPEC says, you know what, fine, we are going to let we're going to let the cuts relax as they are. No need to bring them back in again. And so from the perspective of the oil and gas market, it's pretty here and there. So it's more of a game of, okay, let's watch and wait and see what happens. And then depending on that, we are going to reverse our policy or just go ahead with it anyway. And the part about the voluntary cuts, not only had the OPEC countries committed to a certain number of cuts, there were others in the group who had committed to even more than that, and that was voluntary. So maybe Saudi does that. UAE is probably not going to do it. They've sort of they've had a difference of opinion with Saudi Arabia many times on the direction of OPEC policy, and they want their oil to be out there in the market. And they want their production, because their production capacity is effectively 4.2 million barrels per day. And they feel that they could be putting out a lot more than they're currently allowed by the OPEC quota. And then you have the undercompliers, Iraq and the likes like that, who are sort of incapable of meeting their production target under the quota. Now, because that's happening in the oil and gas scene, for the EU, fine, we can secure gas supplies from maybe Qatar, from the US, maybe other players in the world, but medium term, longer term, we still want to be looking at renewables. Like, the agenda is still 1.5, and regardless of like what the market thinks, whether this can be achieved or not, it's still being pursued pretty aggressively, and we see that in documents that the EU has put out, like the EU taxonomy. And the case that they have made for the renewable directive. Now, as I was saying before, the concept of the corridor between the MENA region and the European region, and it's probably like quite a few examples of that, like the IMEC corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, that originates from Mumbai and then it goes through the GCC and onwards towards Europe. That's one part of it. Now, it's interesting because a lot of these concepts are exactly that. They're at a conceptual stage. Yes, they have been agreed on and parties have signed to them, but like concrete actionable projects are still not there on the ground. The infrastructure for a project like that is not yet there, but it goes hand in hand. You need to develop the projects that will go into this corridor to make the corridor happen. And of course, we know that the Middle East countries have a number of agreements with the European countries to supply them with clean energy. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt have a number of agreements with Southern European nations, especially Greece. It's sort of being seen as like a strategic hub for future energy. And it could be a conduit for green energy coming from this region and going through Southern Europe to like Central Europe, towards Germany, Balkans, what you may have. Anyway, I'd say the market is interesting. Like, geopolitical tensions have, of course, impacted it in ways people weren't really expecting. Maybe there has been a slowdown in some areas, and there has been a rise in trade protectionism, nationalism, the trade restrictions with China and all that. But the overall picture is like, yeah, the green thing is still going on. Like, climate action is being taken. Countries have committed to certain goals, and clean energy is on the rise. And not just for the fact that you're targeting a 1.5 future, it's also cost effective. And at the end of the day, that's what makes it a winning solution for anyone, is the economic competitiveness of it. I'd also like, just lastly on that question, Lauren, I'd probably also say, for the MENA region, they're pretty happy to trade with China. They have no trade restrictions with China, so they're happy to use Chinese technology. And probably like for the US and the EU, they sort of want to keep China on the back burner, or there is a rise in trade policies that restricts the role of Chinese goods into their regions. The MENA region is very happy to use Chinese technology, and utilizing that, then products manufactured from it or energy manufactured from it, exporting that to Europe. And anyway, like concepts like the IMEC corridor or any other green energy corridor, it's very unlikely that you wouldn't have a Chinese contractor on that. They're really cheap, of course, and they have an abundance of expertise and technology, which is is really cost effective. And so when you have different players being a part of it, maybe Saudi wants to build their GCC link to the corridor with a Chinese company. So it's not like they can be completely down and out. It's just like the extent to which they could enter the European market.
It's really interesting to hear perspectives on China and trade agreements there, because obviously I think in the West particularly it's not very well done at the moment, just because of tensions, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, completely side note, but Turkey is using a lot of Chinese technology to create and powerhouse their renewable farms, and I think that's a really great way to remain cost effective. But utilizing that, other than that, is obviously where the questions lie. Like, how does one export and how does one distribute when other players are not that
Yep.
keen on using Chinese technology? So kind of following on to that renewables kind of point. So with the push that we're seeing for renewables, where does oil and gas realistically stand, in your opinion, in today's market?
Sure. So, it's for oil and gas, it's always an interesting time whenever there's talk of climate change. And usually the knee-jerk reaction, and especially what happened after the COVID period when the hydrogen hype began, was, especially coming out of Europe and other similarly minded jurisdictions, was that, oh, it's all the fault of oil and gas producers, and they are the onus, the responsibility for mitigating emissions and meeting this climate goal falls on them. And there was a lot of talk of like immediately switching to renewables or immediately switching to clean energy. But practically on the ground, you require oil and gas to be able to do that. And the reason for that is twofold. One, you need the energy security to be able to create the conditions for future clean energy. And current energy security comes from the resources we have at disposal right now. And the majority of that, or majority of the world system, uses coal, oil, and gas. And expecting that to turn over in the next 5 years is an impossible task, right? These are like legacy projects that have been there for centuries, and systems are established to utilize them. And to be able to work them over to suddenly take in clean energy is a mammoth task. And of course, you want to transition to that point, but you will require the energy security currently to be able to set the conditions for that in your next 10, 15, 20 years, up to 2050. That's one part of it. The second is the transition requires money. And the money comes from oil and gas revenue. So, if you are wanting oil and gas producing countries to be responsible for their part in global emissions, and you want them to transition and to be a part of clean energy, they are going to have to fund the transition or these requirements. And what puts them in a competitive position is the MENA producers, especially. They're large oil and gas exporters, and they receive large cash windfalls. And so at their disposal, they have a large capital asset base that they can utilize to invest in green energy more easily than importing countries or importing regions. And the EU has mostly, importing countries. And for it becomes more of a question of policy and regulation and government grants, government funding to be able to pursue these energy transition projects. While for the MENA regions, it's more easy because, oh, I'm a state-backed company and I have a large cash windfall. I can allocate a portion of this into green energy or greening my operations. And so that's what we have, been witnessing since, I'd say, 2021, 22. There is also like the increase in institutional investment in energy. And if you look at that, things like listed equities, shareholding, bonds purchased, equity stakes and assets, these are mostly in areas which are perceived to have a reliable cash flow. And that is oil and gas infrastructure projects, and the other is renewables. And oil and gas infrastructure projects almost precedes renewables because of the expectation that this infrastructure can be reutilized in the future for green energy, right? You can use it for green ammonia, your green hydrogen, your shipping fuels. A lot of them are going to use this same kind of network layout, same kind of infrastructure. So if we invest in this now, then it promises us a return even in the future because it can be reused. And then the second part of that is, of course, renewables. And a lot of the oil and gas companies are turning to renewables to green their own operations. So be it captive power for their own operational needs, or taking clean electricity from the grid, or being partners in renewable energy projects, which could then provide green energy for their operations while they continue oil and gas. That's another consideration. So funding is, it's going to be there for the oil and gas scene, But I think the sector will have to find for itself a way to fund itself in new and innovative methods or new and innovative ways. The rise of privatization that has been happening. There were the pipeline deals in Saudi Arabia, in UAE. Oman, with PDO, has been doing a number of bond issuances. Bahrain has been looking into privatization, and so if these countries they can find a unique way to fund their oil and gas sector, which allows them to continue using their oil and gas, and in the same at the same time create a carbon space for their exports, then they will continue doing so. You're not going to remove oil and gas at all from the global energy system. It's going to be there even in the most aggressive net zero scenarios, like the IEA ones, where there is they really want oil and gas to come down. But even then, you see that it's going to be used for things like petrochemicals, other hard to abate sectors like aviation, etc. Gas is also more than oil. It's also like an interim fuel because it has this quality of you can associate it with carbon capture, and then you can produce blue hydrogen from it. So in a sense, it can be used to create a cleaner energy transition fuel before you fully transition to the cleanest version, your green one or your dark green one. And the MENA region is already investing so much in gas right now. There is, of course, Qatar is expanding its LNG production capacity. There is a lot of new gas coming out from the UAE. They also have the Ruwais LNG plant that they have planned. And so this is, these countries have their own domestic demand. And they're small countries, and they're able to meet it. But then there will obviously be a large surplus. So then you need to decide, what are you going to do with the surplus? Of course, I'm exporting to the markets that I'm already exporting to, but maybe those markets, maybe a market like Europe in a few years will be like, okay, now we want to transition away from gas and we want cleaner things. So how does the Middle East region think about the gas surplus then? You find new uses for it. So of course, like I said, that becomes hydrogen, blue hydrogen. That could be one thing. You could probably use it in transport or other industry. You can redirect gas from the power sector to more strategic sectors like high value industry for high value add products. And that provides an incentive to the power sector to itself become cleaner. Or you can find new uses for the gas itself. And the other point, of course, over there is that with these new uses that the Middle East region finds for gas, it's also in a way setting up the scene to create more clean premium products, right? So maybe it wants to manufacture steel, aluminium, iron, cement using gas, but with carbon capture. And because you have inputted that of course puts a clean premium on the price of the produced product. And who's willing to pay for that? That's mostly going to be the EU, because the EU CBAM and other regulations like that. And probably in the future, South Korea, Japan, probably even the US, although it seems like a far stretch right now with Trump. But it's something that could happen.
100%. Drill, baby, drill.
Yeah.
The current sentiment. So kind of falling into that, like the government point, how have you been seeing governments in the MENA and Europe balancing that sustainability, energy security, and economic growth? Because I think there are so many nuances within that. Because obviously, people are reliant on oil and gas still. How are they balancing that security with that push for renewables?
Sure. I'd say there are some similarities between both regions, but of course their makeup is entirely different, and the way they approach sustainability with energy security and economic growth will differ. For the EU, as I was mentioning earlier, it's all suddenly become about energy security, which is understandable. They lost access to a major supplier of energy to their markets, and the other part is diversification. So how do they balance their short-term energy with long-term sustainability goals because of the reconsideration of increased natural gas imports for their energy security right now, while at the same time, also promoting the climate bit, the energy efficiency, and reducing reliance on coal. For the MENA region, it's more pragmatic, I'd say. The MENA region really does not have, well, say for a few countries, at least in the GCC, there really isn't a problem of energy security per se. Yeah, maybe some of the countries are net importers, or they do import at times of peak demand LNG or gas, like for Kuwait, for example, even though it has the Al Zor terminal, it needs to import LNG. The UAE takes Qatari gas from the Dolphin pipeline. But overall, we wouldn't say there is a problem of energy security. Yeah, sure. Some of the countries, they want to achieve self-sufficiency. And so because they want to achieve self-sufficiency, the way they approach issues of transitioning and energy efficiency is different. Now in Abu Dhabi, there was the news that you might have also seen, the environmental agency, it's now just launched a new GHG monitoring system, and which is the first for the country. And so they want to be able to utilize that to be, to have a more effective MRV method of tracking emissions from industrial operations, from energy operations, power operations, whatever that may be. And then the consideration is to underpin all of that with a carbon price. So I think it was probably in 2023 when a talk of a carbon price in the UAE was doing the rounds. And the thing is, the thinking was that we're going to have a carbon price which is going to work to incentivize our own transition. So, the EU has since many, many years has its emissions trading scheme and carbon pricing that's going on over there. And that has worked very well for their industry and in greening their economy. For a country like the UAE or for the MENA region, this is the first step. And it's more so as an incentive scheme for industries over here to transition towards green, because the costs they receive are usually subsidized. Fuel costs are low, and there really isn't a penalty on emissions, so to say. And so the strategy from that perspective is that we are going to put in a carbon price, which is maybe not too low, maybe not too high, but just enough to incentivize the transition. You could probably also establish a cap and trade scheme through it. So it's probably good for industrial decarbonization activities. But regardless, the net zero strategies for all of these countries, they recognize that, our oil revenues are going to decline over time, because a lot of the countries will reduce their use for oil and gas, and especially in Europe, they're probably not going to have a lot of it. But like I was saying, in certain sectors, it's always going to be there. And so how do we make a case for it, or how do we always ensure a future market for it? You can do that by technological innovation. So, that's something that the MENA region is pursuing very strongly, making a case for localized manufacturing. Or you can pursue industrial decarbonization through clean energy methods that are not reliant on things like hydrogen or renewables. Probably, maybe, well, no, I wouldn't say not renewables. Renewables would be a part of it in the sense of electrification, recycling, circular carbon economy concepts, waste to energy, and things of that nature.
Yeah. So from kind of like an investment perspective, so obviously we have these companies trying to, where oil and energy will always be present, that they probably don't have to necessarily worry about their revenues being hit too much. But for generally speaking, what are the kind of biggest regulatory hurdles that companies face in gaining that kind of investment in oil and gas, especially when they know realistically they're going to have to scale back their operations?
Yeah, that's actually a very important point. And it's just reminding me of what we were also hearing in Erbil when we were there. A lot of the countries in the Middle East region, while they have similar makeup, they are very different in their socioeconomic standing. So, for example, a country like Iraq differs very widely from a country like the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And of course, if you are a Middle East country that has, you want energy self-sufficiency and you want to reduce your reliance on foreign imports, but in the case of Iraq from Iran, you want to be able to develop energy solutions that can help you meet your demand in the short term. And what's going to help you right now is going to be oil and gas. It's all well and good that, they have a renewables target and they have projects under development to meet that target. But right now, to avoid total blackout and create unrest in the country, I need oil and gas. And maybe like I need a new refining project, I need a new petrochemical project because it's a strategic industry that I can capitalize on. But where do I get the funding from it? I cannot tap a European bank and be like, hey, I'm building a new refinery and it's going to use crude oil and I'm going to burn a lot of crude and I need the money for that to back it up. And of course, you're not going to get the funding from it. So what happens there is it opens a new door. And that's the role of regional banks in the Middle East, right? So if there are regional banks who are willing to support neighboring countries in meeting their energy self-sufficiency targets, they could probably provide funding. Or there is the role of sovereign wealth funds, from the GCC region who might invest in countries like Iraq or Egypt and help them with their oil and gas requirements because they need that to be able to meet their own demand. The other part the challenge that happens is the increasing environmental regulations, stricter emissions targets, carbon taxes, methane emission reductions. They sort of constrain upstream oil and gas production, so exploration and production potential, and that might feel a little constrained for operators worldwide. Maybe especially in Europe, of course, because there is no new financing for oil and gas projects happening at all. But in the Middle East region, these are still being strongly pursued. But I think a good rule of thumb around that has been, if these increasing environmental regulations or emissions targets, etc., are sort of creating are sort of limiting our ability to pursue oil and gas in the way we need it, we can create flexible market structures built for oil and gas that can integrate renewables. So, I was saying before that gas is sort of seen as a transition fuel, right? So, yeah, let me build the infrastructure for oil and gas, and then I will reuse that in the next few years as I'm working my way towards the transition. So that's going to be for blue hydrogen, that's CCS. You can integrate that with industry. There's this whole concept of creating hubs in the UAE. They're called oases. You're going to have an industrial oasis, and it's going to be close to your oil and gas site, but also be connected to your renewable power or a clean energy grid, and you could have a captive green hydrogen plant. And so you have this all-in-one solution, which right now is using oil and gas, but it's future ready for the green energy. And the other thing that MENA countries, they have been looking at is local content requirements, and pursuing projects that increase in-country value. And I think for companies coming from Europe or from North America who want to be part of the energy sector, they're sometimes hit by that because they're not familiar with local content requirements or how to contribute to the in-country value. But countries like the UAE have come up with a scheme where if you can demonstrate that you are innovative and that you have energy efficient methods in whatever your product manufacturing is, whatever your sector is, and you can show that your operations are resulting in energy savings, we will charge you a lower tariff. So you are going to be charged a lower gas price, a lower electricity price. You're going to have greater land rates. Maybe you will be exempt from custom duties or whatever it is. So that's just one way that it's sort of helping companies overcome the regulatory challenge of moving to a completely unfamiliar market.
That's amazing. It's so interesting to hear how that's being incentivized over in that region. So kind of going back into your point, you've mentioned blue hydrogen and green hydrogen quite a few times in CCS. There's a lot of buzz around these. Where do you see them really fitting into the future of the energy markets?
Sure. So firstly, I would say for gas, its next stop is blue hydrogen. And from there, of course, you have gas infrastructure, which you will require to scale green hydrogen and green ammonia and the green fuels, the green methanol, because if you have the LNG infrastructure already in place, you are in a better position to leverage that to be able to utilize these new fuels. Then, of course, the third part of that is the revenue that you are going to be getting from oil and gas for the transition. So because there is substantial investment capital coming from your oil and gas revenue, you can direct it towards hydrogen, you can direct it towards CCS. And the criticism that hydrogen is receiving is oh, and I don't know if you've seen it, but it was just in the news yesterday that there is more of a chance that Elvis will come back to life than hydrogen really taking off. So that's where market sentiment is at the moment. But regardless of that, it's an issue of costs. Once there is someone who is willing to offtake your produced hydrogen, it sets a precedent, and then you can begin scaling up. And because the Middle East region is, it's an oil and gas heavy region, it already has that infrastructure. It's large scale, it's very sophisticated, very modern, well connected. It's all connected to port facilities, and they have their export jetties, and the trade routes are already well established. So you go towards Asia, and you can go around to through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Suez Canal towards Europe. And so you are connecting both the east and west markets. And because you already have this infrastructure, it's easier to leverage that for these future green transition or energy transition uses. The other part of it, of course, for oil and gas is, CCS is a big talk. And because, as I already mentioned, for gas, the next stop would be blue hydrogen. CCS is a big part of it. So you're capturing this carbon. Are you either you store it or you're going to utilize it, right? And for the Middle East region, especially the GCC, the storage is pretty ample. They are characterized by a number of depleted oil and gas wells that can be retrofitted or turned over into CCS storage, which is fine. And also, they have large point emitters or industries which can reutilize that captured carbon. So if from your oil and gas operations you have captured carbon, or from an industrial facility, why not just utilize it again and turn it into a green premium product? There is also talk of CO2 take back if the Middle East exports a product which has a high carbon content, and then that carbon is captured at the destination, final destination, and then that country sends back the carbon dioxide to the GCC for storage. So that's also one part where the oil and gas energy value chain still fits into this role. And finally, I'd say from a renewables perspective, it's energy storage and flexibility. Renewables are very variable, and you require the grid firming for them. And gas plays an excellent role there. So if you can back up your renewable generation with gas generation, that of course, equates into a continued role for gas. And that was also identified by the UAE's Ministry of Energy in their long-term outlook for power generation in the country, where they are targeting a certain high gigawatt of renewable energy, but there is a reserve gas capacity. And the thinking, of course, is the same. Renewables are very variable. Maybe someday you have a cloud cover or you have rain, and you need to ensure that gas can back that up. And if you're not using battery storage, although there are projects now that have been just signed off with battery storage, in the night you can balance that with gas as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Maryam. So I've got a couple more questions for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first being, how can firms best prepare for this kind of shift and build resilience in such kind of an uncertain time? You have people who are kind of drilling towards the hydrogen shift, and people who aren't. So how can firms best prepare themselves and build resilience in this?
Sure. I'd say there are broadly 4 types of strategies that energy companies typically follow. And from my expertise, I can mainly speak to the Middle East companies. And there are 2 large groups, right? So you have the legacy oil business oriented companies. Probably we're thinking of the likes like Algeria, Libya, Iraq, that are really just purely focused on oil production and generating as much oil sales as they can from exports of oil. Then there are others that have become more dynamic, more pragmatic in their approach to oil and gas. They recognize the role of the energy transition and clean energy, and they're sort of moving towards business model diversification or a geographic diversification. They're looking at things like cross-sector investment. I'm going to continue investing in oil and gas, but also in the energy transition. More about agile supply chain management, tech integration. Of course, a famous example there is ADNOC, who sort of leads the way in the GCC with its AI and predictive analytics capabilities. And those things can all be used for, improved supply chain management, improved forecasting, more of a rise of transparency and accountability, and to show their partners, energy partners, especially export partners like the EU, that we are here to support you on the energy transition. So we, of course, we are oil and gas producers, but we are able to back these with energy efficiency means, with cleaner technology, with innovation that sort of further reduces our carbon intensity of production and sets the way for us to support in green energy. And we can then, of course, export that to you. It also, it's interesting because when they do that, they're also sort of avoiding criticism from the EU for still investing so heavily in oil and gas or letting oil and gas be their major business. Because then they're like, oh, look, we're investing in green energy also, and we're investing in your own continent in green energy projects like in Greece, in Poland, wherever that may be. And so it's interesting because for the Middle East countries, it becomes a geographic diversification as well as a business model diversification. So it's two of them. I think two other interesting things to add there. Of course, there's the circular carbon economy concept, which is being championed very heavily by Saudi Arabia, and they see this as a counter to the uncertainty that climate action can bring to the energy scene. And also the rise of strategic mergers and acquisitions. The MENA countries are looking to enter new geographies or to tap new customer bases, and they're not afraid to pursue these now. So whether that's African countries or Central Asian countries, Masdar has its own target of 1 gigawatts of or 10 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. And it's covering a lot of country bases, and that's including Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, African countries, whatever it may be. And lastly, then, of course, there is consolidation for efficiency. So, previously, energy companies in the Middle East were characterized by a number of bureaucratic institutions. And that sort of creates a strain on governance and your operations and how efficient the sector is. And the recent trend has been to streamline all of these into one nimble, agile organization, which wears a lot of hats and covers a wide range of I'd say capabilities under it. And so that has been the case in the UAE. It's also been seen in Oman and Saudi Arabia. And I suppose that's a trend that is probably going to carry on in the rest of the region too.
Lastly, if you had to give one piece of advice to energy companies navigating these market shifts going forward, what would it be?
Sure. Wow. I feel like I gave so many points of advice. Now I have to synthesize them into one. Yeah, I'd say if you're in the Middle East, go for innovation, really. And I'm not saying that to deter you from your traditional line of business or whatever it is. You have a great chance of getting your foot in the door, especially in the GCC, if you can demonstrate any kind of innovation or unique approach to your business, whether it is oil and gas too. So, the Middle East region is very willing, very open arms to take in all kinds of technology, all kinds of projects. And the only differentiating factor over there is what sets you apart from the other kind of project. And if you can demonstrate innovation, if you can demonstrate local content, if you can demonstrate in-country value, you have a great chance of establishing a low-cost, low-carbon intensity manufacturing base here with great IRR, and with a strategic location to both East and West markets. So whether you're going to Asia or you're going to Europe, and you're getting a great return on your capital investment. The region, especially for the GCC, it's very stable. Business climate is extremely friendly. And even with, the progress on the energy transition, there is a lot of progress in infrastructure development for oil and gas. And the reasons for that are the ones that I mentioned, because you want to use it now, today, to meet energy demand. And then tomorrow you want to leverage that for the transition.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll probably wrap up the conversation here. This has been absolutely
Sure.
packed with insights. I'm sure anyone listening will be probably in awe, like as I am, of how
Thank you.
much content
You're
is
very kind.
valuable here. Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Maryam. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.